I discovered my neighbor's secret on a Tuesday afternoon while standing in my own backyard, holding a certified letter from the city's code enforcement department. The letter threatened me with a $15,000 fine for violating residential noise ordinances I hadn't violated. That's when I understood that Margaret Chen wasn't just a difficult neighbor. She was systematically trying to destroy my life. And she had no idea I'd spent the last 3 weeks quietly unraveling every lie she'd told. My name is Rebecca Hartwell. I'm 42 years old, and until 6 months ago, I lived a quiet, unremarkable life in a modest 2-story colonial in Riverside Heights, a middle-class suburb where people knew their neighbors and children rode bicycles on tree-lined streets. I'm a technical writer for a medical device company. Work I can do from home 3 days a week. My husband David died 4 years ago from pancreatic cancer. Since then, it's been just me and our daughter Sophie, who's 16, and navigating the complicated territory of high school with the kind of resilience that still amazes me. The house had been our sanctuary. David and I bought it 12 years ago, back when the neighborhood was just starting to transition from older families to young professionals with children. We'd painted every room ourselves, planted the garden, installed the swing set that Sophie had outgrown, but I couldn't bring myself to remove. After David died, I'd clung to this house like a lifeline. It represented stability, memory, safety. Margaret Chen moved in next door 8 months ago. The previous owners, the Kowalskis, had been elderly and sweet, the kind of neighbors who brought over cookies at Christmas and waved from their porch. When they moved to assisted living, their daughter handled the sale quickly. Margaret arrived on a Saturday in late March with a moving truck, 2 luxury cars, and an attitude that immediately set her apart from the rest of our friendly, low-key street. She was in her early 50s, impeccably dressed even on moving day, with sharp features and an expression that seemed perpetually annoyed. Within the first week, she'd complained to 3 different neighbors about various infractions: trash cans left out too long, a basketball hoop positioned too close to the property line, a dog that barked during afternoon walks. I didn't take it personally at first. Some people need time to adjust to new environments. I'd even walked over with a welcome basket, homemade muffins, local coffee, a handwritten note with my phone number. She'd accepted it with a thin smile that never reached her eyes and closed the door before I could introduce myself properly. The first real incident happened 3 weeks after she moved in. I was working from home, participating in a video conference call with my company's engineering team, when Margaret began renovation work. Not minor repairs, full construction, jackhammers, power saws, the kind of noise that makes productive work impossible. I'd checked the township website before my call. Construction was permitted between 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. on weekdays. She was within her rights, even if the timing was inconvenient. I'd muted myself during the loudest moments and apologized to my colleagues afterward. But the construction continued for weeks, every single weekday starting at exactly 8 a.m., right when my morning meetings typically began. I'd tried talking to Margaret twice. Both times she'd been polite but dismissive, telling me the work was necessary and would be finished soon. The contractors she'd hired were professional but distant, unwilling to discuss timeline or scope. By mid-May, I'd started scheduling my calls earlier or later to avoid the noise. It was manageable, if annoying. Sophie complained about trying to study for finals with construction sounds vibrating through the walls, but we adapted. I told myself this was temporary. Then the parking situation began. Our street had ample parking, but Margaret started positioning her 2 vehicles, a Mercedes sedan and a Range Rover, in ways that blocked access to my driveway. Not completely, not enough to legally justify towing, but positioned just awkwardly enough that I had to execute complicated multi-point turns every time I left my house. When I mentioned it to her, standing in her driveway on a warm Saturday morning while she watered imported plants that clearly weren't suited to our climate, she'd looked at me with polite confusion. "I'm parked on a public street," she'd said simply. "I believe that's perfectly legal." Technically, she was correct, but the placement was so obviously intentional, so precisely calculated to cause maximum inconvenience without crossing into actionable territory. The garden lights came next. Margaret installed high-intensity security lighting along her property line, positioned at angles that flooded my bedroom window with harsh white light every night. I'd invested in blackout curtains, but Sophie's room faced the same direction, and the brightness disrupted her sleep schedule during crucial exam weeks. I filed a polite complaint with the Homeowners Association, providing photos and documentation. The HOA president, a retired teacher named Bill Morrison, had been sympathetic but ultimately powerless. The lights technically complied with community guidelines regarding brightness and positioning. Margaret had clearly researched the regulations carefully before installation. Each incident alone was minor, defensible, technically within legal boundaries, but together they formed a pattern of calculated harassment. I began documenting everything: dates, times, photos, brief descriptions. I'd learned this instinct from David, who'd been a civil litigation attorney before his diagnosis. "If something feels systematically wrong," he used to say, "you're probably not imagining it. And documentation is power." By June, the situation had escalated in ways I couldn't have anticipated. Sophie came home from school one afternoon in tears. One of her teachers had pulled her aside after class, expressing concern about Sophie's home environment. Someone had called the school's counseling office anonymously, suggesting that Sophie was being neglected, that our home was chaotic and unsafe. The accusation was absurd and easily disproven. Sophie's grades were excellent. She was active in theater and debate. Our home was clean, organized, and well-maintained. The school counselor apologized profusely after meeting with us, confirming that the anonymous call had raised red flags, but that clearly no intervention was needed. But the damage had been done. Sophie felt violated and embarrassed. I felt a cold, creeping sense of being watched, targeted, undermined in ways I couldn't quite prove. That same week, I received a violation notice from the township regarding my landscaping. According to the complaint, my front yard exceeded the permitted grass height by 3 inches, violating municipal codes. I'd mowed the lawn 4 days earlier. The grass was perfectly maintained. I'd taken photos immediately, brought them to the township office, and had the violation dismissed within an hour. The clerk who helped me had been apologetic, explaining that they were required to investigate all complaints, but that clearly this one was frivolous. "Who filed the complaint?" I'd asked. "Anonymous," she'd replied, her expression sympathetic. "But this is the 3rd complaint we've received about your property in the past month, all dismissed, all clearly without merit." 3 complaints. I'd only known about 2. That evening, I'd sat in my kitchen with Sophie, who was doing homework at the counter, and I'd allowed myself to acknowledge what I'd been avoiding. Margaret Chen wasn't just a difficult neighbor. She was waging a deliberate, methodical campaign to make my life unbearable. The question was why? I'd done nothing to provoke her. We'd barely interacted beyond my failed attempts at friendliness. I'd never complained about her construction noise until it became truly impossible to work. I'd never confronted her aggressively or involved authorities unnecessarily, yet she'd targeted me specifically, consistently, with a precision that suggested planning rather than random irritation. Sophie had looked up from her calculus textbook, studying my face with the perceptiveness children develop when they've lost one parent and learn to read the emotional weather of the other. "She's doing this on purpose, isn't she?" Sophie had said quietly. I hesitated, not wanting to sound paranoid or vindictive. "I think so," I'd finally admitted, "but I don't understand why." Sophie had closed her textbook, her expression shifting into something older than her 16 years. "Then maybe we need to find out." That conversation marked the shift in my approach. I stopped trying to understand Margaret's motivations through normal neighborly logic. Instead, I started investigating. I began with public records, property transfers, tax assessments, building permits, all available through the township's online database. Margaret had purchased the house for $475,000, slightly below market value, suggesting either a quick sale or undisclosed property issues. She'd immediately filed for extensive renovation permits: kitchen remodel, bathroom upgrades, structural modifications. But something caught my attention in the permit applications. The property was listed under an LLC, Chen Holdings Properties, rather than Margaret's personal name. That wasn't unusual for investment properties, but this was clearly her primary residence based on her constant presence. I'd learned from David's work that people who hold personal residences through corporate entities usually have specific motivations: asset protection, privacy, or preparing for future transactions. None of those motivations suggested someone planning to settle into a friendly neighborhood. I'd expanded my search, looking for Margaret Chen in professional directories and business registrations. What I found was interesting. She owned a small real estate investment company specializing in residential properties in transitional neighborhoods. Her business model appeared to involve purchasing undervalued homes, renovating them quickly, and flipping them for substantial profit. That would explain the aggressive renovation timeline. But it didn't explain why she'd moved into this particular property rather than simply flipping it, and it certainly didn't explain her campaign against me. Unless the thought had formed slowly, a suspicion rather than a conclusion. Unless she wanted my property. Our houses were identical in structure, built by the same developer in the same year. Mine was on a slightly larger lot with better southern exposure, which David had always said would add value. If Margaret was planning to combine properties or redevelop the land, my house would be a logical target. But I had no intention of selling. I'd made that clear in casual conversations with neighbors, mentioned it to the HOA president, even stated it directly to Margaret during one of our awkward encounters when she'd asked vaguely whether I ever considered exploring other housing options. If she wanted me to sell, harassment would be a logical, if unethical, strategy. Make the living situation so unbearable that I'd eventually give up and leave. The realization had shifted something fundamental in my approach. This wasn't about personality conflicts or misunderstandings. This was about money and property, motivations I could understand and potentially counter. I'd started documenting with a new purpose. Every incident, every complaint, every interaction. I'd also started researching Margaret's business history more thoroughly, spending evenings after Sophie went to bed scrolling through property records and business filings in surrounding counties. What I discovered was a pattern. Margaret had used similar tactics before. In 3 previous neighborhoods, she'd purchased properties adjacent to homes owned by single women, elderly couples, or families going through obvious difficulties. Within months, those neighbors had sold their homes, often at below-market prices. Margaret had then either combined properties for larger developments or renovated and flipped both homes for substantial profit. The documentation was subtle but consistent. Noise complaints filed against her neighbors, building code violations reported anonymously, aggressive landscaping and lighting installations, and in each case the targeted neighbor had eventually sold and moved away. She had a system, and I was her current target. But Margaret had made one critical miscalculation. Unlike her previous targets, I wasn't intimidated by bureaucratic harassment or neighborhood politics. I was tired, grieving, protective of my daughter, and absolutely unwilling to be pushed out of the home David and I had built together. If she wanted a fight, she'd chosen the wrong person. The certified letter from code enforcement had arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in late June. I'd been working in my home office reviewing documentation for a product manual when the doorbell rang. The postal carrier had handed me the thick envelope with a sympathetic expression that suggested she knew what it contained. Code enforcement letters always looked the same: official, intimidating, threatening consequences for violations you may not even know you'd committed. I'd opened it standing in my kitchen, Sophie at school, the house quiet except for the distant sound of Margaret's contractors working on some new project next door. The letter alleged that I had violated residential noise ordinances by operating industrial equipment at prohibited hours, specifically between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. on multiple occasions throughout May and early June. The violations carried a potential fine of $15,000 and possible legal action if not immediately rectified. I'd read it 3 times. My hands steady, but my mind racing. Industrial equipment. I owned a lawnmower, a string trimmer, and a snowblower, all used during daylight hours, well within permitted times. I hadn't operated any equipment after 8 p.m. since moving into this house. Someone had filed a false complaint, and that someone had provided specific dates and times, detailed enough to prompt code enforcement to issue a formal violation notice, rather than simply investigating and dismissing the claim. I'd walked into my backyard, standing in the space where David and I had planted tomatoes and herbs, where Sophie had learned to ride her bicycle, where we'd hosted neighborhood barbecues in better years, and I'd looked at Margaret's house, at the expensive renovations and imported landscaping and strategic security lighting. And I'd understood that this was the escalation I'd been anticipating. Margaret was no longer content with minor harassment. She was moving toward forcing me out through legal and financial pressure. The miscalculation she'd made, the critical error that would ultimately unravel her entire strategy, was assuming I would respond emotionally, with anger or fear or desperation. Instead, I'd walk back inside, sat down at my computer, and opened the detailed documentation I'd been compiling for the past 2 months. Then I'd made 3 phone calls. The first was to an attorney who specialized in neighbor disputes and property law. Her name was Patricia Reeves, and she'd been recommended by a colleague whose family had dealt with a boundary dispute years earlier. Patricia had listened carefully to my summary, asked precise questions about timeline and documentation, and agreed to review my materials. "This is harassment," she'd said after a pause. "Systematic and intentional. The question is whether we can prove it definitively and what remedies are available. Send me everything you have." The second call was to a private investigator named Marcus Webb, whose services David had occasionally used for litigation support. Marcus specialized in background investigations and documentation, exactly what I needed. "I want to know everything about Margaret Chen," I'd told him. "Her business history, financial records, any legal actions she's been involved in, any patterns in her property transactions, everything that's public record, and anything you can legally discover beyond that." Marcus had quoted me a retainer fee that would strain my budget, but I'd agreed immediately. This was an investment in keeping my home, protecting my daughter, and stopping someone who'd clearly done this before. The third call had been to Bill Morrison, the HOA president, requesting a formal meeting to discuss a pattern of harassment that was affecting not just my quality of life, but potentially my property value and legal standing. Bill had been reluctant. HOAs typically avoided getting involved in individual disputes, but I'd been persistent. "Margaret Chen has filed 3 anonymous complaints against me with township authorities, all dismissed as frivolous," I'd explained. "She's now filed a false code enforcement complaint that could result in a $15,000 fine. This isn't about personal conflict. This is about someone using harassment to manipulate property values and force out residents. That affects the entire community." Bill had agreed to convene a special meeting of the HOA board within 2 weeks. I'd hung up feeling not triumphant, but grimly determined. Margaret had assumed I would crumble under pressure, that a single woman raising a teenage daughter would be too overwhelmed or frightened to fight back. She'd been wrong. Over the next 3 weeks, I'd continued my routine, work, parenting, maintaining the house, while quietly building my case. Patricia Reeves had reviewed my documentation and confirmed that I had grounds for a harassment claim, possibly even a restraining order if the behavior continued. More importantly, she'd identified specific legal violations in Margaret's approach. Filing false reports with municipal authorities was a criminal offense, and her systematic targeting of my property could support claims of intentional infliction of emotional distress. Marcus Webb had been even more productive. Within 10 days, he'd compiled a comprehensive report on Margaret's business activities. The picture that emerged was exactly what I'd suspected, but with details that were genuinely shocking. Margaret Chen had built her real estate investment business almost entirely on a strategy of targeted harassment. She would identify undervalued properties in transitional neighborhoods, purchase a home adjacent to a vulnerable target, and then systematically make their lives unbearable until they are sold at distressed prices. She'd done this successfully in 8 different neighborhoods over the past 12 years. Her targets were always predictable: single parents, elderly residents, families dealing with medical or financial crises, people who were already stressed and unlikely to have the resources or energy to fight back. She'd refined her methods carefully, always staying just within legal boundaries, never doing anything that would result in criminal charges or civil liability. But Marcus had discovered something else, something Margaret had clearly tried to hide. 3 years ago, a previous target, a widowed schoolteacher named Linda Hartman, had filed a civil lawsuit against Margaret, alleging harassment and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The case had been settled quickly and quietly, with terms that included a non-disclosure agreement. Marcus had tracked down Linda Hartman through professional directories. She'd relocated 2 states away, but she'd been willing to talk, especially after Marcus explained that Margaret was using the same tactics against another single mother. "She made my life hell," Linda had told Marcus during their phone conversation, which he'd recorded with her permission. Every single day was something new: complaints about my dog, my lawn, my trash cans, anonymous calls to social services suggesting I was an unfit mother, construction noise that made it impossible to sleep. I held out for 8 months before I couldn't take it anymore. I sold my house for $60,000 less than it was worth just to get away from her. Linda had provided documentation from her lawsuit, communications from Margaret's attorney, settlement terms, records of the harassment. All of it supported the pattern Marcus had identified. The settlement included a non-disclosure agreement, Linda had admitted. "I'm probably violating it by talking to you, but I don't care anymore. What she does is predatory and wrong, and if there's any way I can help stop her from doing it to someone else, I will." Marcus had incorporated Linda's testimony and documentation into his final report, which he delivered to me on a quiet Sunday evening in mid-July. Sophie was at a friend's house, and I'd sat at my kitchen table reading through 50 pages of detailed evidence that confirmed everything I'd suspected. Margaret Chen was a predator who targeted vulnerable people for financial gain, and she'd made the critical mistake of targeting someone who was grieving but not broken, stressed but not defeated, and absolutely unwilling to be the next Linda Hartman. The HOA meeting took place on a Thursday evening in late July at Bill Morrison's house. The board consisted of 5 members: Bill as president, 2 vice presidents who handled landscaping and architectural review, a treasurer, and a secretary. I'd been given 20 minutes to present my case. I'd prepared meticulously, organizing my evidence into clear categories: timeline of incidents, documentation of harassment, pattern analysis showing Margaret's behavior across multiple properties, and legal expert opinion from Patricia Reeves regarding the serious nature of the violations. I'd spoken calmly, methodically, letting the evidence speak for itself. I hadn't editorialized or expressed anger. I'd simply laid out facts, dates, documents, and witnesses. The board members had listened in increasingly uncomfortable silence. When I'd finished, Bill had cleared his throat and thanked me for the thorough presentation. "This is significantly more serious than typical neighbor disputes," he'd admitted. "We'll need to consult with our association attorney before determining appropriate action." The treasurer, a retired accountant named Dorothy Chen, no relation to Margaret, had spoken up. "If even half of what's documented here is accurate, Margaret Chen is violating multiple HOA covenants regarding neighborly conduct and community standards," she'd said firmly. "We have an obligation to protect residents from this kind of systematic harassment." The meeting had concluded with the board agreeing to investigate further and schedule a formal hearing where Margaret would be required to respond to the allegations. I'd left feeling cautiously optimistic. The HOA had limited power, but their involvement added another layer of pressure, an official recognition that Margaret's behavior was unacceptable. 3 days after the HOA meeting, Patricia Reeves had filed a formal cease and desist letter with Margaret Chen and her attorney, outlining the harassment allegations and warning that continued behavior would result in legal action, including restraining orders and civil lawsuits. Margaret's response had come within 48 hours through her attorney, a blustery letter denying all allegations, claiming I was the aggressor attempting to harass their client and threatening counter-litigation if I continued making false and defamatory accusations. Patricia had read the response with visible amusement. Standard intimidation tactics, she'd told me during our phone call. They're trying to scare you into backing down. Don't. We have documentation they can't refute, and their aggressive response actually supports our harassment claim. The code enforcement violation regarding the alleged noise had been resolved quietly. Patricia had submitted my documentation showing I'd never operated equipment during prohibited hours, along with a formal request that the township investigate who had filed the false complaint. The violation had been dismissed with a written apology from the code enforcement officer. More importantly, the township had flagged Margaret Chen's address for investigation. Filing false complaints was a criminal misdemeanor, and if a pattern could be established, charges could potentially be filed. By early August, I'd built an overwhelming case. Documentation, witness statements, expert analysis, legal opinion, everything necessary to prove that Margaret Chen had systematically harassed me in an attempt to force me to sell my property. But I still didn't understand the full picture. Yes, Margaret wanted my property. Yes, she'd targeted me using tactics she'd refined over years. But why this specific property? Why this specific neighborhood? What made this particular piece of real estate worth such extensive effort and risk? The answer came from an unexpected source. I'd been watering my garden on a warm Saturday morning in mid-August when a well-dressed man in his 60s approached, introducing himself as Robert Chen, Margaret's ex-husband. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion," he'd said politely. "I heard through mutual acquaintances that you're having difficulties with Margaret. I thought you might benefit from some context." We talked for over an hour, standing in my backyard while Sophie read on the porch and Robert shared the history I'd been missing. Margaret and Robert had divorced 5 years ago after 28 years of marriage. The divorce had been acrimonious, primarily regarding property division. Margaret had built her real estate business using community assets, but Robert claimed she'd used unethical and potentially illegal tactics to maximize profits. "She's brilliant at identifying vulnerable targets," Robert had explained. "Single parents, elderly people, anyone going through a difficult transition. She researches them thoroughly. Social media, public records, even hiring private investigators to learn about personal struggles. Then she moves in and makes their lives systematically unbearable until they're desperate to sell." "Why does she do it?" I'd asked. Robert had looked genuinely sad. "Money primarily, but also power. Margaret grew up poor, raised by a single mother who struggled constantly. She became obsessed with financial security and control. Real estate gave her both. And somewhere along the way, she stopped seeing people as human beings with lives and struggles. They became obstacles to profit." He'd paused, looking at my house thoughtfully. "Your property is worth approximately $520,000 in current market conditions. If she could purchase it at a distressed price, say $420,000 from a desperate seller, and then combine it with her property, she'd have a double lot worth approximately $1.2 million. After renovations, she could sell for $1.4 to $1.5 million. Net profit after costs would be around $400,000 from a single transaction." The numbers had clarified everything. This wasn't personal. It was simply business. predatory, unethical business that destroyed lives for financial gain. Robert had given me one more piece of information before leaving. Margaret's business is over-leveraged, he'd said quietly. She took significant loans to finance her recent property purchases, betting on quick turnaround and high profits. If even one or two projects fail to deliver expected returns, her entire financial structure could collapse. She needs this transaction to work. She's probably more desperate than she appears. That knowledge had shifted my strategy. Margaret wasn't just greedy. She was vulnerable, and vulnerable people made mistakes. The opportunity came in early September when Margaret filed yet another complaint, this time with the health department, alleging that my property had standing water that could breed mosquitoes and constitute a public health hazard. The health inspector had arrived, conducted a thorough inspection, and found absolutely nothing. He'd been visibly annoyed at having his time wasted with a false complaint. "Ma'am," he'd said before leaving, "this is the fourth complaint we've investigated at this address in 3 months. All have been baseless. I'm required to document this pattern. Whoever is filing these complaints may face charges for abusing emergency services." Patricia Reeves had immediately filed a motion with the local court requesting a temporary restraining order based on the pattern of harassment, false complaints, and escalating behavior that was affecting my ability to work and my daughter's well-being. The court hearing had been scheduled for late September. Margaret would be required to appear and respond to allegations under oath. Her attorney had filed multiple motions to dismiss, all denied. The judge had reviewed the documentation and determined there was sufficient evidence to proceed. 2 weeks before the hearing, I'd received an unexpected phone call from a real estate developer named Thomas Park. He'd been researching properties in our neighborhood for a potential residential development and had encountered Margaret Chen's business activities. "I wanted to reach out because I think we might have mutual interests," Thomas had explained. "I'm aware of the situation with Ms. Chen. I'm also aware that she's attempting to assemble properties for a development project. What she doesn't know is that I've already secured options on 3 other properties on your street. If she succeeds in forcing you out and combining your properties, her development plan would directly compete with mine." "What are you proposing?" I'd asked carefully. "I'd like to purchase her property," Thomas had said, "for slightly above what she paid, enough to allow her to escape with minimal loss but not enough to make the transaction profitable after renovation costs. This would effectively end her development plan and remove her from your neighborhood." He'd paused before continuing. "However, I can only make this work if she's motivated to sell. Right now, she still believes she can succeed in acquiring your property. But if she were facing legal consequences, financial pressure, and the realization that her plan has failed, she might be willing to cut her losses." We'd talked for over an hour, Thomas explaining his development vision and how it would actually benefit the neighborhood. Affordable housing mixed with market rate units, preservation of the existing character, minimal disruption to current residents. By the end of the conversation, I'd understood that I had an unexpected ally. Thomas Park didn't care about my personal conflict with Margaret, but he had strong financial motivation to see her development plans fail, and he had resources to make that happen. The restraining order hearing took place on September 28th in a small courtroom with wood paneling and fluorescent lighting. I'd arrived with Patricia Reeves, my documentation organized in 3-inch binders, my testimony prepared and practiced. Margaret had arrived with her attorney, dressed impeccably, projecting confidence. But I'd noticed the slight tension in her jaw, the way her fingers repeatedly smoothed her skirt. Small signs of stress that suggested Robert's information about financial pressure was accurate. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Patricia had presented evidence methodically. Timeline of incidents, documentation of false complaints, witness testimony from Linda Hartman via video conference, expert analysis showing a pattern consistent with intentional harassment. Margaret's attorney had attempted to portray me as an overly sensitive neighbor who had misinterpreted normal activities as harassment, who had weaponized the legal system because of personal animosity. But the documentation was overwhelming. Dates, times, photographs, official records, witness statements, everything told the same story. Margaret Chen had systematically targeted me using tactics she'd refined over years, all in service of forcing me to sell my property at a distressed price. The judge had been a stern woman in her 60s who'd clearly heard countless neighbor disputes. But as the evidence accumulated, her expression had shifted from routine skepticism to genuine concern. When Margaret's attorney had finished his presentation, attempting to characterize his client as a victim of unfair accusations, the judge had addressed Margaret directly. "Ms. Chen, I've reviewed the evidence presented here today. I've also conducted my own research into your business practices and previous property transactions. What I've seen is a pattern of behavior that, frankly, I find deeply troubling." Margaret had remained silent, her face carefully neutral. "This court is granting a temporary restraining order," the judge had continued. "You are prohibited from contact with Ms. Hartwell or her daughter. You are prohibited from filing complaints about her property with any municipal authority without first notifying this court and providing substantiated evidence. You are required to adjust your exterior lighting to eliminate illumination of Ms. Hartwell's property. And you are ordered to cease all construction activities that create noise levels exceeding township standards during her work hours, specifically 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. on weekdays." She'd paused before delivering the final statement. "Additionally, this court is referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for investigation regarding potential criminal charges for filing false official reports. Ms. Chen, you've engaged in a calculated pattern of harassment that goes beyond simple neighbor disputes. If you violate this restraining order in any way, you will face immediate legal consequences." I'd watched Margaret's carefully maintained composure finally crack, just slightly, just enough to confirm that she understood she'd lost. Outside the courtroom afterward, Patricia had been quietly triumphant. "This is a significant victory," she'd said. "The restraining order severely limits her ability to harass you. The referral to the DA creates potential criminal exposure, and most importantly, this is now a matter of public record. Any future attempt to target you or sell your property under duress would be clearly documented as part of this pattern." I'd driven home, feeling not jubilation, but profound relief. The immediate threat had been neutralized. Margaret could no longer legally harass me without facing serious consequences. But I knew this wasn't truly over. Margaret had built her business on targeted harassment. She'd invested significant money in the property next door. She was financially over-leveraged and desperate for this transaction to succeed. A restraining order wouldn't change her fundamental motivations. It would only force her to find more subtle approaches. I'd been correct. 2 weeks after the hearing, I'd received a formal offer to purchase my property, not from Margaret directly, but from a real estate investment company called Riverside Holdings, LLC. The offer was for $495,000, below market value but not obviously distressed pricing. Marcus Webb had investigated Riverside Holdings within 24 hours. It was a shell company registered 3 weeks earlier. The registered agent was an attorney who specialized in anonymous business structures. But through careful research of associated properties and financial connections, Marcus had traced ownership back to Margaret Chen. She'd created a corporate entity to make an offer that would technically comply with the restraining order while still pursuing her original goal. It was clever, technically legal, and exactly the kind of tactics someone familiar with manipulating legal boundaries would attempt. I declined the offer through Patricia, who'd sent a formal response noting that we were aware of the true ownership of Riverside Holdings and that any further attempts to acquire the property through intermediaries would be reported to the court as violations of the spirit, if not the letter, of the restraining order. Margaret's attorney had responded with another blustery letter, threatening litigation. Patricia had filed it with the court as evidence of continued harassment. That's when Thomas Park had made his move. He'd contacted Margaret's attorney directly, expressing interest in purchasing her property, not combined with mine, but as a standalone transaction. His offer was $490,000, slightly above her purchase price, but well below what she'd need to cover her renovation costs and loan obligations. Margaret had initially declined, clearly still hoping to salvage her development plan, but Thomas had been patient. And as weeks passed with no progress toward acquiring my property, no opportunity to implement her development vision, and mounting financial pressure from her over-leveraged loan structure, her position had weakened. In late October, Margaret's attorney had reached out to Thomas's team to discuss revised terms. The negotiations had taken 3 weeks, but ultimately, financial reality had prevailed. Margaret needed to liquidate the property before loan payments became unsustainable. Thomas's offer, while disappointing, allowed her to escape with minimal loss rather than facing potential foreclosure. The sale had closed in mid-November. Margaret Chen moved out on a cold Tuesday morning, her luxury vehicles packed with personal belongings. Her imported plants left to die in the approaching winter. I'd watched from my kitchen window, Sophie beside me as the moving truck pulled away. I'd felt no triumph, no satisfaction, just quiet relief that the ordeal was finally over. Thomas Park had been true to his word. He'd purchased the property not for immediate development, but as part of a longer-term neighborhood improvement plan. He'd hired contractors to complete the renovations Margaret had started, then leased the house to a young family, a couple with 2 elementary school children who introduced themselves with genuine warmth and brought over cookies as a welcome gesture. The HOA had formally censured Margaret Chen in absentia and revised community guidelines to specifically prohibit the kind of harassment tactics she'd employed. Bill Morrison had privately apologized to me for not taking action earlier. "We should have recognized the pattern," he'd admitted. "We should have protected you better." I'd appreciated his acknowledgement, even though I understood the limitations of HOA authority. By December, life had returned to something approaching normal. The code enforcement violations had been expunged from my record. The false complaints had been formally withdrawn. Sophie's school had removed all notes regarding the anonymous concerns about her home environment. I'd even received a letter from the district attorney's office informing me that Margaret Chen had been charged with 3 misdemeanor counts of filing false official reports. The charges would likely result in fines and probation rather than jail time, but they would create a permanent criminal record that would complicate her future business activities. Patricia Reeves had called me on a quiet evening in early January, almost exactly 1 year after Margaret had moved in next door. "I wanted to follow up on something," Patricia had said. "Thomas Park's attorney reached out. Thomas was impressed by how you handled this situation, your documentation, your strategic approach, your restraint. His company is looking for a technical writer to help with development proposals and community outreach. He asked if you might be interested in freelance work." I'd been surprised but intrigued. The opportunity would provide supplemental income and interesting projects, working with someone who'd proven to be an unexpected ally. "Yes," I'd said. "I think I would." Now, 6 months later, I sit in my home office on a warm June morning, working on a community development proposal for Thomas Park's company, while Sophie practices her graduation speech in the living room. She'll be delivering it next week as valedictorian of her high school class. The house next door is filled with the sounds of a happy family, children playing in the yard, their mother gardening, their father building a treehouse on weekends. They're exactly the kind of neighbors the Kowalskis were, the kind that make a neighborhood feel like a community. Sometimes I think about Margaret Chen and wonder what happened after she left. Marcus Webb told me she'd moved to a different state, attempting to rebuild her business away from the reputation damage she'd suffered here. I hope she learned something from the experience. Though I suspect people like Margaret rarely do. What I learned was something different. I learned that strength doesn't always look like confrontation or anger. Sometimes it looks like patience, documentation, and strategic thinking. Sometimes it looks like recognizing when someone's cruelty is actually desperation, and using that knowledge to protect yourself and others. I learned that vulnerability, being a single mother, being grieving, being the target of someone more powerful, doesn't mean weakness. It means having something worth protecting and finding the courage to do so. Most importantly, I learned that the home David and I built together, the sanctuary I've preserved for Sophie, was worth fighting for. Not because of property values or financial investments, but because it represents stability, memory, and the future we're still building together. Margaret Chen tried to take that from me. She failed not because I was stronger, but because I refused to let fear dictate my choices. The revenge I got wasn't dramatic or explosive. It was simply ensuring that someone who'd built a business on exploiting vulnerable people finally faced consequences for her actions. It was proving that documentation and patience and strategic thinking could defeat predatory behavior. And it was discovering that even in the worst situations, even when someone is systematically trying to destroy your peace and security, you have more power than you realize. You just have to be willing to use it. If you've dealt with a nightmare neighbor or found yourself targeted by someone who seemed intent on making your life unbearable, I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. How did you handle it? What did you learn? Sometimes knowing we're not alone in these experiences makes all the difference. And if you found this story helpful or interesting, please subscribe to the channel. I share more stories about handling difficult situations with strategy and patience, rather than anger and confrontation. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't dramatic, it's simply refusing to be broken.